Okay, assalamu alaikum everyone. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Sallallahu ta'ala wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. So we're going to continue on where we left off, inshallah. Just a quick recap, if I may. Imam Muhasibi in the past few paragraphs, maybe 2 or 3 pages or so, has been talking about the obligations of individual organs, individual limbs. So I've said this again and again, and I think this is worth recapping. So we understand the ahkam of Sharia, the rulings of the Sharia, the commands of Allah, etc., in general terms, right? And generally we designate certain values to them that in Islamic law go like this. Like we say certain things are fard, wajib, sunnah. Sometimes we say sunnah mu'akkada, sunnah ghayr mu'akkada, like in certain prayers. We say mustahab, etc. So this is on the positive side of the spectrum. Things that one should do, we kind of add, we put these values on them to express different levels of emphasis. Fard being the really important one that you absolutely must do. Not doing it is a major sin. On the other end of the spectrum, the negative end of the spectrum, on the if you like, the prohibitions side of things, we say that you have the haram, the makruh. In the Hanafi madhab, you have 2 types of that: makruh tahrimi, makruh tanzihi, and so on. And in between all of that, you have the permissible. There are some, there are some other things, like some fuqaha, some fuqaha speak about khilaful awla, something just not quite being bad enough to be makruh even, or makruh tanzihi even, but just better not to do. And some things that Imam Muhasibi is talking about fall into that category. So in between the positive values, or the must do's and the should do's, and the must not do's and the should not do's, if I might put it like that, you have this big gulf, or this massive area, which is known as the generally permissible, right? Which is the mubah. And within the mubah, Imam Muhasibi starts off this whole section by saying that within the mubah, there are things that if one was to avoid them, then it's better. It's a fadila, right? So basically, strictly speaking, we might say this is permissible. We have no evidence to suggest that it is makruh or impermissible in any way. However, Muhasib is saying there are still things that, we can easily conclude that it is better to not do them, even though they are permissible. And I've given various examples of that. I've spoken, like some of these areas could be to do with how many pairs of shoes you have, something as mundane as that, something that we might not give any thought to. How careful you are with your gaze, or how careful you are with what you say. And we spoke about in the obligations of the tongue. We spoke about how being careful about what we say. And sometimes things that we say might well fall within the purview of what is permissible, but it's kind of better to be avoided because there is a kind of problematic dimension to them, or they can lead to other problems, right? When in the food that we consume, there's probably a wide area, right, that covers all the permissible things that we eat, but in that there's a lot that is better avoided, and it could be for health reasons, which the Sharia encourages. The Sharia encourages good health. It could be for quantity reasons, we're just eating too much, right? And the Sharia has certain guidelines around that. There are hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that speak about, limiting our intake and so on. So based on that, we may well find ourselves consuming. So if we stick to the consumption example, right? Whether it's clothes or whether it's food, etc., we may find ourselves consuming things in a kind of permissible way, but that our permissible consumption is beginning to tread on, or is beginning to go beyond the scope of perhaps what the Prophet ﷺ advised, or what is advised by the Sharia under kind of its general principles, right? So for example, moderacy is a general principle of the Sharia, right? For example, avoiding waste, across the board, not in any specific issue, but across the board, avoiding waste is generally, a principle in the Sharia, right? That we avoid waste in as many things as we can, and perhaps you can bring both of them within the purview of moderacy, right? Of being balanced and moderate, and so on and so forth. So suddenly you can see that going beyond what is advisable and recommended in the Sharia can easily push a person towards a point where perhaps, even though somebody might not be able to articulate it to them in the form of a legal decree, they have actually moved far into something that is harmful to them physically, harmful to them emotionally, harmful to them spiritually, and therefore, generally speaking, based on those general principles, it is actually possible to say that they're doing something that is wrong, but they're waiting for a legal pronouncement, which doesn't exist, because we're supposed to be guided by those general principles. And this is kind of exactly what Imam Muhasibi is speaking about. I think each day that we've been discussing this topic, I've tried to find a different way to articulate this issue, right? And today I've spoken kind of I've spoken about it in terms of these general principles. And general principles are important because they give us our worldview, right? We can't look for a fatwa for everything in life. Life doesn't operate in that way, all right? Law doesn't dictate some of the finer aspects of life. For the finer aspects of life, we use some general principles that inform our values, inform our worldview, inform our broader kind of understanding of right and wrong. And we bring those things into the table. And these are some of the things that the Prophet ﷺ has articulated, and some of the muhaddithun have captured under the kind of broad heading of the Prophet ﷺ's concise pronouncements, right? And of course, Imam Nawawi famously did that with his 42 hadiths, where he speaks about the general value of good intention and sincerity. He talks about the general principle of things like avoiding harm, right? And avoiding reciprocating harm. The general principle of what we're discussing now. He brings the hadith in his 42 of al-halalu bayyin wal-haramu bayyin. The halal is clear, the haram is clear. In between there's this ambiguous area in which one should apply caution, and so on. So there are these general principles. Some of the muhaddithun, I actually did a video series on this. Some of the muhaddithun have tried to capture some of the general principles of Islam within 4 or 5 hadiths, right? And they've said, and they've tried to, and they picked these ahadith based on the notion that these ahadith impact a massive part of a person's life, right? Innamal a'malu bin niyat is one of them. Da' ma yaribuka ila ma la yaribuka is one of them. Give up that which puts you into doubt for that which does not put you into doubt. Meaning, do things that aren't doubtful. Stick to what isn't doubtful. La darara wa la dirar is one of them. Don't avoid harm. The causing of harm to yourself, to others, the reciprocation of harm. Don't cause harm because somebody's caused you harm. some of the muhaddithun mention the hadith of bid'ah, right? You know, man ahdatha fi amrina hadha ma laysa minhu fahuwa rad. Anybody who innovates within this religion something that is not part of it is rejected. Some of the muhaddithun include that as one of those comprehensive statements that cover a massive chunk of the deen, and so on, right? So you know, the statements of the Prophet ﷺ, guidelines of the Sharia that give us something of a worldview, right? This has been attempted by scholars in various ways. You know, Imam Nawawi's 40 hadith is an attempt at that. I just wanted to use this conversation to signpost that, and this is why it's really useful to memorize Imam Nawawi's 40 hadith, right? I was just talking yesterday, actually, we were having a chat in the family. Most of us were actually having a laugh, and then my father walked in and started talking about some aspects of deen, and then we kind of this verse came to mind, and that is the verse in which Qarun, who is the famous around the time of Fir'aun, there was this wealthy man named Qarun, right? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I think this is in Surah Al-Ankabut anyway, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells this story of Qarun coming out with all of his wealth and the believers giving him some nasiha. And I said that one interesting, you know, there's a verse in there that can be used as a, you know, as like a manifesto of life when it comes to a person's materialism and a person's conduct towards others, right? And that verse is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, quoting the believers' advice to Qarun, he says, وَابْتَغِ فِي مَا آتَاكَ اللَّهُ الدَّارَ وَلَا تَنْسَ نَصِيبَكَ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا وَأَحْسِنْ كَمَا أَحْسَنَ اللَّهُ إِلَيْكَ وَلَا تَبْغِ الْفَسَادَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and seek with what Allah has given you the hereafter. Seek with that which Allah has given you the hereafter. And don't forget your portion of the dunya. Meaning, you know, we're not expected to live the lives of hermits and vagabonds and, you know, be homeless and have no money and have no wealth and be completely without means. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says your primary objective is to seek the akhirah with what you have. However, the world, there are necessities in the dunya. There are necessities in this worldly life. There are people naturally have material necessities that they have to fulfill. So therefore, don't forget your portion of the dunya. وَلَا تَنْسَ نَصِيبَكَ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا وَأَحْسِنْ كَمَا أَحْسَنَ اللَّهُ إِلَيْكَ. And be good to others the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has been good to you. وَأَحْسِنْ كَمَا أَحْسَنَ اللَّهُ إِلَيْكَ وَلَا تَبْغِ الْفَسَادَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. And do not spread trouble, corruption, mischief. You know, all of these are possible translations on the earth. So seek the akhirah with what Allah has given you, with whatever you possess, right? With your possessions, seek the akhirah. Don't forget your portion of the dunya, number 2, right? Be good to others the way Allah has been good to you, and don't spread mischief on the earth. Don't cause trouble. Manifesto of life, right? What's the point of me telling you this? Well, this is under the heading of general principles, right? You know, these are general principles. You know, you can't. That's never going to be articulated as a fatwa, right? Be good to others the way Allah has been good to you. Well, what's the extent of that? What are the boundaries of that? How good do I have to be? Be as good as you can. Right? Be as good as you can. The more you do, the better. That, you know, that's basically how something like that would be answered. That's how it works. And the problem with often with a lot of people is that they're so used to this idea of halal and haram, the idea of finding out what is permissible, what is impermissible, which is important. But that is a very specific domain, meaning that it actually occupies a minority of your life. If you want to live life as a Muslim, then you will find that a small number of things dictate that which is clearly halal, that which is clearly haram, by way of law, by way of legal edicts, legal rules, right, or ahkam. And then the vast majority come under general principles. And if you haven't reflected on what those general principles are, what then happens is people tend to wander around looking for clear guidance for everything, as in looking for a halal fatwa or a haram fatwa for everything, right? Or there has to be a makruh or a etc., etc. Whereas the vast majority of life falls within that purview of the permissible, within which general principles have to be applied in order for us to be able to guide our way through. Okay, so I hope that was useful, inshallah. Let me give you that verse number, sister. I was expecting somebody to ask that. Okay. I can never do verse numbers off by heart. It's not one of my weaknesses. So here we go. It's Surah Al-Qasas, verse number 77. Okay. And Surah Al-Qasas is Surah 28. It's like, you know, general principles in marriage, right? You know, Allah created love and mercy between man and woman, almost like as a naturally endowed quality, as two naturally endowed primary qualities. And the purpose of marriage is for people to find tranquility with one another, to find peace and tranquility and contentment in one another. And you know, husbands and wives are like garments for one another. Hunna libasul lakum wa antum libasul lakum. Women are garments for you and you are garments for them, right? وَلَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. You know, as a general rule, there is a kind of equity of rights and duties. They enjoy as many rights. They enjoy the like of, right, approximately the same amount of rights and duties, or rather they have roughly a kind of the same amount of rights as they have duties, meaning there is a kind of balance of rights versus duties, and so on. And you know, there is a little margin or a daraja that men have been given, which, you know, is understood to be that the daraja of playing that protective role, or that role of being the leader of the house. So these general principles kind of often, if a person can, so knowing your halal and your haram is obligatory. So that's like you tick that and you move on, right? You have to know what's halal, you have to know what's haram. That's fard ain. Once you've known that, really the ability to live a well-informed Islamic lifestyle is about how well you're able to apply those general principles. And really everyday life is based on that, because the majority of everyday life isn't so much about the halal and isn't so much about the clear halal and the clear haram and etc., but rather these everyday things, right, for which you're not going to find a clear pronouncement. Do you understand? When you wake up in the, you know, when like I noticed that people get this wrong in just normal kind of life, right? When you wake up in the morning, should you give your wife and your children a kiss and a hug and greet them with a smile? You're not going to find a ruling that says that's fard, or even mustahab. That particular example that I've just cited, you know, that is mustahab or sunnah or anything like that. But there is a general rule that will tell you that that's a sunnah and a mustahab, and that is very, very beneficial, because the Prophet ﷺ generally spoke about meeting each other with a smiling face, right? You know, about that meeting each other with a smiling face is a sadaqah, right? You know, that you know, the Prophet ﷺ spoke about the value of being a person of good conduct, the value of good akhlaq. When the Prophet ﷺ encouraged good akhlaq, he didn't exclude one's family. You say, oh, you have to be nice to everybody, but your family, no, you have to go and look for a fatwa for that. You have to go to the Sharia Council to determine your behavior towards your family. Didn't say that, right? The general rules of good akhlaq apply to the family. And if you look at the hierarchy of rights, then the people who are prioritized with regards to your good conduct are going to be your family, the people immediately around you, right, and so on. So that's how basically general principles work. And I feel that, I don't know why, I mean, I'm not just talking about people, I'm talking about me and everyone, that we just have this habit of just forgetting that somehow, because we've got like you know, tunnel vision. We've got blinkers on basically, and our blinkers just show us the you know, the halal haram fatwa, okay, and the general principles are somehow in the periphery, so far in the periphery that we can't see them. Anyway, so the next part that Imam Muhasibi talks about, so we've spoken about so under that, you know, Muhasibi speaks about the obligations of the heart, the obligations of sight, of the eyes, the obligations of the tongue, right? And today he's talking about the obligations of the ears, okay, of one's hearing. So I'm going to go into that now, inshallah ta'ala. I thought that introduction was, you know, was necessary. And like I said, I've been talking about this in different ways in every session. So he says, وفرض بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وفرض السمع تبع للكلام والنظر فكل ما لا يحل لك الكلام فيه والنظر إليه فلا يحل لك استماعه ولا التلذذ به والبحث عما كتم عنك تجسس وسماع اللهو والغناء وأذى المسلمين حرام كالميتة والدم. وقال عبد الله بن عمر رضي الله تعالى عنهما نهينا عن الغيبة والاستماع إليها وعن النميمة والاستماع لها. وسئل القاسم بن محمد عن سماع الغناء قال إذا ميز الله بين الحق والباطل يوم القيامة أين يقع الغناء؟ قيل في حوز الباطل. قال فأفت نفسك. Okay, and وليس من جارحة أشد ضررا على العبد بعد لسانه من سمعه لأنه أسرع رسول إلى القلب وأقرب وقوعا في الفتنة. وقد ذكر عن وكيع بن الجراح رحمه الله قال سمعت كلمة من مبتدع منذ 20 سنة ما أستطيع إخراجها من أذني وكان طاووس إذا أتاه مبتدع سد أذنيه لئلا يسمع كلامه. Okay, so that's basically about hearing. So Muhasibi says, he says, and the obligation, the fard of the hearing, you know, to use the actual term, the fard of hearing, of the ears, if you like, it follows the fard of speech and sight, meaning that they're interconnected, right? So you know, so there is a kind of rule that can encompass all three. So he goes on to mention that rule. He says, كل ما لا يحل لك الكلام فيه والنظر إليه فلا يحل لك استماعه. Everything that everything that is impermissible to speak of and to look at. It is not permissible for you to hear it and to enjoy listening to it, right? لا يحل لك استماعه ولا التلذذ به. It is not permissible for you to hear it, to listen to it. I mean, let's say listening to it, right? Because you can hear things, because sometimes what you hear you can't control. So it's not permissible for you to listen to it and for you to enjoy it, to take any pleasure in it. So the assumption here is that sometimes you might not be able to avoid listening to something or hearing something, but it's in that situation, the question would be, are you taking pleasure out of it? And if you take pleasure out of it, and then there is a problem. Okay. And then he says, seeking out, digging around after, right? So seeking out that which has been hidden from you is spying, right? He's saying, he's telling us straight, right? So if something has been hidden from you, concealed from you, if there's something about somebody that they don't want to show you, for you to go and seek it out is spying, right? And that's the finding the ruling about that is easy, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly prohibits it in the Quran when he says وَلَا تَجَسَّسُوا. Allah says لَا تَجَسَّسُوا, don't spy. So therefore, it's, you know, once you establish that seeking out something that has been concealed from you is spying, you know, therefore seeking out something that is concealed from you is haram, because Allah forbids it in the Quran. Yeah. So that's another aspect of the obligation of the hearing, of the ears. And then he says, and listening to idle things, wasteful things, excessive things, and listening to music, and listening to listening to things that harm the believers, right? سماع اللهو والغناء وأذى المسلمين. So listening to things that are kind of like just excess, things that are completely waste, completely idle, and so on. Similar to what we talked about, fudulul kalam, where what people say gets to a point where it's just complete waste talk, absolute nonsense, basically. And nonsense is a good word, right? So listening to nonsense, basically, right? So listening to nonsense and listening to music and listening to things that harm the believers. If somebody is being, there is something that's being discussed that harms the believers, and you're sitting there listening to it, taking pleasure out of it, right? Like it's some kind of pantomime. Yeah, like it's all, you know, sometimes people listen to gossip and they'll be like, this is awesome drama, you know, this is better than watching a movie, you know, etc., etc., or this is music to my ears, and they're sitting there and they're enjoying it. That's exactly what he means by taladduth, taking pleasure in things that are actually what you're listening to and taking pleasure in is actually a haram act being conducted by someone else. The person who is gossiping or backbiting, they are committing something haram. You're taking pleasure in that, and therefore you are also committing something haram. So he says that these three things, the three things he's mentioned here, the kind of nonsense, music, and harm to believers, listening to these things is as haram as eating a dead animal's flesh, an animal that has not been slaughtered according to the halal method. Eating haram meat, basically, is the same as eating haram meat and drinking blood. Right? It's the same. It's just as haram. And then he quotes Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma, and he says, Abdullah ibn Umar said radiallahu anhuma, we were forbidden from ghiba as well as listening to ghiba, and from gossip as well as listening to gossip. Meaning it's not just doing the act, but also listening to the act was also forbidden. Okay? And Al-Qasim ibn Muhammad, who is the grandson of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, one of the tabi'un, he said that he was asked about listening to music, and he said, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will differentiate between 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 truth and falsehood on the day of judgment, where will music stand? Which category will music fall in? So somebody said, well, it will fall into the category of batil, of falsehood. So he said, well, then just ask the fatwa to yourself. فَأَفْتِ نَفْسَكَ, ask your own self, how do you feel about something like that then? You don't need to ask me. And that was his way of answering the question. So I'll talk about that inshallah a little bit. And then he says, there is no organ, there is no limb, no organ that is more harmful to the person after the tongue than his hearing, or his or her hearing, because it is the fastest messenger to the heart. Because what you take in through your auditory sense, through your hearing, has a profound impact on the heart. So he calls it asra'u rasulin ila al-qalb. It is the fastest of messengers to the heart. Wa aqrabu wuqu'an fil fitna. It is also the most likely thing to put you into some kind of fitna, to put you into some kind of test or trial, a test of your iman, a test of your morality, a test of your values, a test of your commitment to the deen, a test of your commitment to the sharia. That kind of test, it is likely that things that you hear, you are more likely than anything else to end up being tested by that which you hear. And Waqi' ibn al-Jarrah, rahimahullah ta'ala, was asked, who's Imam Shafi'i's famous teacher, he was asked, it was mentioned to him that, sorry, it is said about him, it is mentioned about Waqi' ibn al-Jarrah, وَقَدْ ذُكِرَ عَنْ وَقِيْ ibn al-Jarrah, that he said that I heard something, I heard a word, a sentence from a mubtadi', from a person of bid'ah. So in those days, when they talked about someone of bid'ah, they meant somebody with incorrect aqidah, incorrect beliefs, right? Like a mu'tazili or a shi'i and so on. He said, I heard something from a mubtadi', a person of bid'ah, 20 years ago. He said, I can't get it out of my ears, right? So, we say nowadays, like, you can't unhear it. Sometimes you see things and you can't unsee it. Sometimes you hear things, you can't unhear it, right? So he's saying, I can't unhear it. And Tawus, who is another famous scholar from the Salaf, when a mubtadi' used to come, he used to do that, right? Because sometimes what they had to say used to be disturbing to them, right? Tawus used to find it disturbing, and he didn't want that to bother him all night and bother him the next day. He didn't want that disturbance. He wanted to shelter himself from it. So when a mubtadi' came to him, he would cover his ears so that he would not hear what he has to say. And this is just an example of, Imam Muhasibi is mentioning these things as an example of how careful the Salaf used to be when it comes to protecting their ears from listening to something that they shouldn't listen to, or hearing something that they shouldn't hear. We should have some precaution, at least, right? At least try to avoid the things that are blatantly haram, like backbiting and gossiping and things like that, which inevitably means that you have to choose your company wisely, because who do you hear these things from? I mean, assuming that, for example, you've worked hard yourself to avoid engaging in these acts, then the next step is to basically surround yourself with company that will not engage in it as well, because otherwise it's just backbiting. If there is no constructive reason for you to be speaking about someone, then chances are you're backbiting them. If there's no constructive reason for it, if there is no constructive reason for talking or about someone, or listening to others talk about someone, then you're probably gossiping or listening to gossip. So these are extremely dangerous things, because they are sins. There's no ifs or buts, right? These things are sinful. Okay, inshallah. Yeah. So one of the sisters is saying in the chat, is saying many non-Muslims have much better akhlaq than Muslims, because most Muslims have blinkers on. And obviously, when I was talking about blinkers, what was I talking about? I was saying the blinkers are actually, you know, they're kind of, one of my teachers used to talk about veils of light, meaning sometimes we are veiled from seeing the right thing to do by other things that we interpret as good, or that are actually in principle good. So therefore he called them veils of light, right? Meaning because they are light, we allow ourselves to be blinded by them because we think I'm engaging in something good, right? So, and I'll give you some examples of that after I finish this point. So over here, the blinkers I'm talking about is the blinkers of constantly looking for a halal and a haram answer for everything. The point is that where there is a halal and haram answer, there is a halal and haram answer. Where there isn't, it's important to know the general principles of Sharia. And that is why it is ulama always encourage that we know the virtues of things. We know, we make a habit of knowing what is good to do and what is good not to do. Because then because these things tend to inform our habits in our everyday life, right? And we end up living our lives in the kind of clear and narrow, as opposed to ending up in areas of doubt, constantly ending up in areas of doubt, because we can't find that haram fatwa. There is no haram fatwa, so I'm going to kind of continue, messing around in the dark or in the twilight, right? Because that's kind of the gray area, isn't it? So why? Because it's not haram, so therefore it must be permissible. Well, not quite. If you apply the general principles of the Sharia, you might find that things that are permissible are probably best avoided, because the general principles of Sharia give us our values, give us our compass. I think that's the best way, right? Our compass. And when adults don't have that compass, they don't have the ability to pass it on to their children. So children end up with no compass, right? Other than, and for them it's like, and then obviously, then you have a lot of people don't invest in learning the halal and the haram properly. So their knowledge of halal and haram is limited. So when they think something isn't haram because they don't know it to be haram, that doesn't mean it's not haram. It just means they don't know, right? They just don't know the ruling because they've not learned it. So that's another aspect. Coming back to what my teacher said about veils of nur, one example that he gave, which is actually quite an obvious example, is a veil of nur. An example of a veil of nur is when one good deed that is less important obstructs you or blinds you to another good deed that is more important, so that in order to fulfill a nafal, you end up missing a fard or a wajib, right? So for example, there can be any number of examples, right? It's like the famous example of a person who in order to pursue the virtue of tahajjud, ends up waking up late for fajr, right? Stays up for tahajjud all night, which is a nafal, but doesn't take precaution with regards to fajr, and ends up too exhausted for fajr and misses it. So the tahajjud is not a bad thing, right? But it ended up veiling this person, or blocking this person from fajr. So it ended up being a kind of a veil of light. Okay, so the tahajjud isn't bad. It's still something of light, but it did end up veiling that person. But fundamentally, what's problematic, what's wrong is the person's understanding, the person's outlook, right? They've got their compasses it's malfunctioning basically, and so on. There can be lots of other examples in that way. I mean, at the root of it really is lack of knowledge. Okay, so there's time for one more, I think. So Imam Muhasibi goes on to mention the fard of smell, so another sense. He says, وَفَرْضُ الشَّمِّ تَبَعٌ لِلسَّمْعِ وَالْبَصَرِ فَكُلُّ مَا حَلَّ اسْتِمَاعُهُ وَنَظَرُهُ جَازَ لَكَ شَمُّهُ وقد روي عن عمر بن عبد العزيز رضي الله تعالى عنه أنه أتي بمسك فأمسك عنه أنفه فقيل له في ذلك فقال وهل ينتفع منه إلا برائحته. Okay, so he said, he said, and the obligation of smell, right? So what smell is another sense, right? So what are the duties with that fall upon that particular sense? So he said it is like hearing and sight, right? Meaning it follows the principle of hearing and sight, in that everything that is halal to hear, halal to see, it is permissible to smell, right? And he gave a story of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz rahmatullahi alayhi to kind of show how an example of the caution or the scrupulousness of early Muslims in this regard, where it was reported that Umar ibn Abdul Aziz rahmatullahi alayhi was presented some musk, right, perfume, and he blocked his nose from it, right, and he refused to smell it. And so somebody said, well, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing that? Yeah. And he said, well, how else? I mean, the only way to benefit from musk and from perfume is to smell it. And what he was trying to say basically was that it's not permissible for me to benefit from this. Yeah. And therefore I'm going to avoid it. Now, you need a bit of historical context to understand that, right? So Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was who? He was Khalifa. Right? He was a ruler, right? And so Umar ibn Abdul Aziz rahmatullahi alayhi was very cautious about using public wealth for his personal benefit. In his mind, the only way to benefit from something that is sweet smelling, something like fragrance, right, is to smell it. And that fragrance that was presented to him was from the public purse. It was from the Baytul Mal. And he had made it a principle that he would not personally benefit from the Baytul Mal. So when musk was presented to him that he knew to be from the Baytul Mal, he refused to benefit from it. And in his mind, how do you benefit from musk? The only way to benefit from musk is to enjoy its smell. So he refused to enjoy the smell and blocked his nose. Makes sense? So that was his level of precaution with regards to that. But the general principle is that something is permissible to look at, something is permissible to hear, something is or something is permissible to benefit from. If you take the example of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz rahmatullahi alayhi, then it is permissible to smell it. Otherwise, it isn't permissible to smell it. Okay, and unless of course it's unavoidable, in which case there's always leeway and there's always rukhsa, there's always dispensation for things that are unavoidable. Right, so the next thing that he talks about is rather long, so I'll leave it inshallah. He's going to talk about hands and feet, so we'll talk about that next week. So if there are any questions with regards to these things, then I will take them. So generally, basically what we are talking about is how to guide ourselves with regards to things that are permissible, but the Sharia still has these broad guidelines, and we have to find ways to help guide ourselves kind of in this area. And while it may appear like there is no guidance, that's not the case, and it's not complicated either, right? It's not complicated. All it requires is for people to apply precaution and to apply the general principles of the Sharia. Okay, inshallah. Right. I said I would go back and talk about music, right? Because I'm pretty sure people are that's gonna be on people's minds. So I'm going to mention. So I'm going to. Somebody's already asked a question about it. So first and foremost, let's differentiate between music and singing. Okay. So where there is, from the literal meaning of the word ghina, it may appear as though music, singing, the whole lot of it is being prohibited. But the only singing that is prohibited is singing that accompanies haram music. okay? And singing that because singing is words, right? So singing that has haram words in it, words that are, so for example, some of the things that we spoke about, right? Haram to say, haram to hear, right? So those same things would be haram to hear in music. They would be haram to hear in song, and they would be haram to hear in poetry as well. Okay. Similarly, obscene, kind of profane singing that excites people's lust, or encourages sin, or diminishes faith, diminishes morality. These types of things would be impermissible to listen to, even if it was just singing with no music. That's what I'm talking about. Even if it was just singing with no music. Most of the prohibitions with regards to music is to do with ma'azif, is to do with music, the use of musical instruments. Here, the vast majority of scholars pretty much prohibit them, blanket prohibit them, right? And they say that musical instruments are prohibited with the exception of the daf, with the exception of a one-sided drum, and it's permissible to use that, and it was used in weddings, etc., etc. Some scholars have gone a bit further and spoken about other instruments and that kind of thing, and there is a minority group of scholars who permit other instruments and basically qualify the impermissibility of music with music that accompanies bad lyrics and haram lyrics, or music that comes from a place of haram, or a place of sin, or a place of or a place where the pursuit of music has nothing to do with the pursuit of the akhirah. This is why, even where in the Muslim world where people may use other musical instruments, you will find that this, if you like, the genre of music, of the song that accompanies those musical instruments, although haram according to some scholars, but if we stick to the people who think it's permissible, the genre of the lyrics is still devotional in nature, meaning that even though there's music perhaps, or a wider range of instruments that are being used with that music, the content of the music isn't romance. The content of that music isn't culture or something or other, but the content of that music is still religion. It's still devotional in nature, it's spiritual in nature, it's praise of the Prophet ﷺ, it's longing for the akhirah, longing for Jannah, it's praise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's that kind of thing. And that has pretty much been the tradition throughout Islamic history, with the minority of people that have even allowed musical instruments. So, and that kind of will answer the question about some of the odd turns that popular nasheed culture has taken nowadays with, and I mean culture quite deliberately here. So the culture of pop concert like events, girls screaming, etc., etc. The culture of, girls chasing after nasheed artists, believe it or not, that apparently happens. Screaming after them, screaming out their love for them, etc. Girls in hijab, and I'm not saying boys wouldn't do that, but most of the nasheed artists are men, and most of the people that tend to do that tend to be girls. So I'm not stereotyping, just stating the reality. And all of this is basically from a culture that's alien to Islam, which I think would put even legitimate kind of nasheed singing, even if we were to say that the minority, if these people follow a minority opinion, let them follow it. I would say that these particular aspects of it fall in the haram, because these things are alien to Islam, right? And to be honest, they're embarrassing. It's embarrassing that it happens, and it's embarrassing to see these things. Okay. Then you have, this seems to be this strange culture of, now these kind of these events becoming increasingly events where there's hijab is practiced less and less. People started dancing. Believe it or not, we had a stall at an event, that event that used to happen regularly, organized by Islam Channel. I've forgotten what it's, Global Peace and Unity, I think it was. And we had a stall at the event, I remember, and I happened to pass by. I can't remember the exact contents, but I basically saw a nasheed with music being played from the stage, and I caught a glimpse of the audience, right? And people were dancing to it, right? I'm talking about, like not something, not as a kind of, not kind of, I don't know, not kind of just swaying from side to side or anything like that. I'm talking about proper pop dancing, basically. So, like, I mean, that's just crazy, right? So it's taken this horrible turn. So I would say that even if we are generous with regards to opinions, and we say, and there are many scholars who argue that the minority opinion with regards to musical instruments that suggests is permissible is a legitimate opinion. Let's just go with that for now. A lot of what's happening is outside of any opinion, and it's just straight out haram. Okay? Then you have the vast majority of scholars saying all musical instruments are impermissible except for the deaf. And then you have a minority that say, other instruments are permissible, provided that the content of the lyrics and the purpose of the music itself is devotional. The purpose isn't just entertainment. And that's another problem. Another problem is that a lot of music, even in the name of Islam, is now the purpose of consumption is just lahu. It's lahu. Basically, what we've been talking about all this time, just passing of time, excess, right? As opposed to devotional. And devotional music is when the words and perhaps even the music, and I don't know how that would work. I don't know how that works and the science behind it, but the words and the music, whatever it may be, turn a person's mind and soul towards the spiritual, right? Towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or a person's mind turns not towards the beats, or not towards the music, and not towards how they feel personally in terms of at that moment themselves, how it makes them relax, but towards dhikr of Allah and so on, which was really the whole kind of point of it traditionally. Anyway, that's all I'll say about it, inshallah. There are some more questions now. So I've fulfilled my promise of discussing this. So there's one more question here. What if a close family wants us to attend a gathering with a lot of music? Also, what about the background music in children's cartoons? That's a good question. I'm hesitant to speak in the language of fatwa on this, because I'm not a mufti and I don't want people to follow my opinion on it. But I do feel that because of certain principles, like it being, or put it this way, basically, if one of the areas in which I think that that minority opinion can be availed of for people who perhaps find that it is very, very difficult to avoid cartoons and things for children, and there really isn't a strong enough Islamic cartoon genre, or where there is an Islamic cartoon genre, all the production is from people who take the minority opinion with regards to music and its permissibility, right? Pretty much everything that's produced in media that is Islamic in nature, whether it is Islamic TV channels, or whether it is cartoons, or whether it is series, etc., utilizes music for effect, right? So I would, the simple answer to the question would be that when it comes to background music that is for the sake of effect, then the Sharia could only stretch as far as saying, well, the minority opinion could be availed of in that regard. But the only reason why we would do that is because there's no alternative. If there was an alternative, then we would always say the alternative is better. All right. So that's that's really as far as I can go, and that's not a fatwa. That's just me giving you the breadth of opinion, saying that these are all of the opinions out there and so on. I personally would incline to say, given that my own children watch cartoons and there's music in those cartoons, and I have pretty much no way of avoiding it other than to shut them out completely, while everybody around them does these things and really depress them, which is exactly what would happen nowadays, given how much stimulation there is out there from devices. I tend to kind of tell myself that I will educate them about this as they grow older, and for now I look at the minority view as a blessing, and perhaps that's my weakness, but that is basically how I look at it, and I hope that answers your question, sister. So the first part of your question was, what if close family wants us to attend a gathering with a lot of music? Again, it depends on what kind. You've heard what we've said, right? If it was me, I would tell them I won't come if this is what's going to happen. Does that make sense? So I've been to so let me elaborate a bit more. So I've been to family events where kind of, but I suppose that's, I suppose it depends on your position in the family, right? So I've been to events where behind my back the music is played, and then as I've walked in, it stopped. But that's probably because of me and who I am, right? And also I'm around my extended family. I'm one of the oldest of the second generation, right? So there's our parents, my father, my mother, both alhamdulillah are alive, and so on. And then there's their generation, uncles, aunts, etc. And then in the next generation, I'm one of the oldest. And being, somebody who's associated with knowledge and deen and so on, things tend to stop basically once I turn up. And therefore I can go to an event knowing that while I'm there, it won't happen. But I personally don't like going to somebody's event and spoiling it for them by just giving them a lecture. I would rather work on those people separately in the hope that they will eventually stop those things. All right. And I do believe in gradualism. So therefore, if a person, if they, like if people are used to normal mainstream music, they're absolute utter nonsense and filth that is mainstream music. And then they find that kind of Islamic nasheeds, even with music, is something that helps them wean off of that. Then regardless of what the vast majority of scholars say, I would say that has to be a good thing. Even if you take the view that it's a lesser evil, it has to be a good thing. And perhaps with more development and more nurturing and more learning and more education and more spiritual development, people will eventually decide that, well, this is another nonsense that I don't need, in the kind of vein of what we discussed with Imam Muhasibi's statements, that this is another indulgence in my life that I don't need, and I have better things to do, right? Like, for example, I'll read good content, and I'll engage in dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and pass my time in that way. Okay. Yeah, but so the sister who says Omar and Hannah Islamic cartoons for kids are an alternative. Yes, absolutely. But I believe they also are produced with music. I think they have a kind of non-musical alternative as well, I think. But it is produced. My point is that the producers produce it with people's consumption in mind, and they know that some people are happy to kind of consume it with the music and some people aren't, so they try to give both alternatives. But even though, like, we haven't got a production that just says, you know what, this is going to be in the clear and we're going to come up with an alternative and there's going to be no music. Simply because the nature of media, the nature of cartoon, the nature of this type of thing is that it's very difficult to make it entertaining, or engaging, if to use a better word, if it was educational, for example. It's very difficult to make it engaging without the music. Well, I don't know. Nobody's tried it. Maybe it is possible, right? But nobody's tried it. I suppose it'll take somebody who is very creative and very courageous, and who kind of doesn't mind spending a lot of money for something that might fail and not be consumed, to come up with that alternative, right? But it is something that needs to be explored in the digital age, because without alternatives, people aren't going to go cold turkey. It's unrealistic to expect people to just switch off. The only way is to say this is a space. The digital space is a space, and it's got all sorts of stuff, and it has to be basically that part of that space has to be filled abundantly with good content, and some of that content has to be, Islamic, and that also means that there should be, I would say that there should be a kind of representation of the majority view that music is haram, and therefore there should be generous content in there without music, like you get with nasheeds. I suppose that's a good example, because you get the nasheed with music consumers, and people know there is a market for that, so they produce that. And of course there are nasheed artists who believe and take that view, and I know whole nasheed labels behind which are people of knowledge, people who have a background in knowledge, and they take the view that the music is permissible, and they produce the whole shebang. And I have a degree of discomfort with that, but they're not people who don't know, or who are just doing it for the sake of money, right? They know, they've taken a conscious position. I believe that one of the guys behind one of the nasheed labels is writing a book about the musical aspect of it. That's what I've heard. I'll wait for it to come out and I'll read it. So it's not that people don't know, people are consciously taking an opinion. But in the nasheed industry, you also see the non-music opinion being represented, right? Because a lot of people follow the view that it is haram, or just want to be careful. They just want to be cautious, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. And therefore you have lots of nasheeds that are devotional in nature, really great stuff, actually, really beautiful nasheed. And I wholeheartedly enjoy those, and I have a playlist that I use regularly, and I fill idle moments with that, like when I'm walking, for example. I've been walking a lot lately. So either you fill it with Quran, and I don't like listening to Quran and not paying attention. I don't like listening to Quran passively. So if my mind is passive, I'd rather play a nasheed and kind of have the luxury of focusing on the words on and off. All right, but I personally like nasheed lyrics to be devotional in nature, rather than I don't know the alternatives. Sometimes, like some nasheed lyrics are kind of pointless. They're not bad, but they're just kind of pointless, and I don't like it. I just consider that to be bad writing. Yeah. So, like there is this alternative representation among nasheeds, there really isn't one in other forms of media, like cartoons. That's my point, right? And there perhaps should be, but it does require massive commitment. These things are not easy projects. They take a lot of money and a lot of effort. And cartoons, for example, if we just stick to cartoons, it's not easy to just go and produce something that hardly anybody will consume. But eventually someone will do it, inshallah. Anyway, if there's no other questions, it's already 40 minutes past. Oh, there's some more comments. Okay. Yeah, I do agree that this is a slippery slope, and obviously this is not the only area in which the deen is being diluted. But there is but having said that, right, we shouldn't be too cynical. There is something quite profound in people still seeking out a religious opinion and a religious position, a Shari'i position. Okay, that is much, much better than people doing things with absolutely no concern for what the Sharia has to say. And differences of opinion in the Sharia are a mercy, because sometimes different opinions give people a dispensation. Whether they take that dispensation or not is up to them. You don't have to take it, I don't have to take it, but others can, and that is the mercy of the Sharia. Okay, so I don't judge people who take the other opinion. It's as simple as that. It is their right. That is what it's there for. And sometimes it helps people very constructively, like the example I gave you of people successfully being able to give up mainstream music. Like, I am completely lenient with my children when it comes to nasheeds. Absolutely. If it's an nasheed and it's devotional in nature, listen to it, no problem. I don't restrict them. What I will do is have this conversation. Like, I'll talk to them about the different opinions and so on and so forth, simply because it has meant that they have avoided any interest in mainstream music. And when I look outside, my son is 17, right? The average 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old is out there playing some nasty stuff loud on phones, and that's how they enjoy their time outdoors, even in winter, right? They enjoy their time by playing this nonsense. You go to the park. I went the other day with my middle son to kick a ball around, right? And it was just him to get a bit of fresh air, and for me to see how I'm coping, post-COVID, to see if my body can handle it and so on. Ended up having to sleep for 5 hours, but anyway. And there we were, right? Our piece, thought it was an empty park, empty little football kind of area, one of the few that was open. And there we were, there in the corner were youth, Muslim youth, kind of blasting out some nonsense. So for me, I have to see it as a blessing that my children, because of the anashid, have never shown any interest whatsoever in mainstream music. Whereas when I was their age, I did show an interest, even coming from an Islamic background, because there was nothing else, right? So, it was something that I ended up taking an unfortunate interest in, and then having to kind of extract myself out of, after having committed to, following the Sharia. It's hard to avoid, right? So the nasheeds, even the nasheeds with music, do provide that alternative, so that, because music is naturally attractive to people. It's sound, right? And in fact, the ulama who say that it is permissible, that's one of their arguments is that it's beauty in sound. There's no reason why it should be impermissible, other than if the Sharia has made a clear pronouncement. But the Sharia, there are pronouncements, there's a hadith in Bukhari, etc., that appear to prohibit musical instruments, but it has to be understood contextually, and they understand it to be in the context of lahu, in the context of where the content is impermissible. So that's their argument. Wallahu alam. The majority don't agree with it, but it's not a done and dusted issue. My point is that people who follow that opinion, let them. It's their prerogative. All right. And there is wisdom in the breadth of the Sharia. It's something that, I never used to have this attitude, but I've always find that there is good in the breadth of the Sharia, and in the different views of the Sharia, and in people even taking dispensation from even minority views. There is a mercy, and I've seen that throughout my life. Okay, inshallah. Yes, absolutely. It's natural. It's human nature, right? To be attracted to a beautiful voice and a beautiful sound. I mean, is that not what we hear in nature, right? Do birds not sing? This is, if you think about that, it's natural. But the same thing can be used to manipulate, just like a beautiful voice can be used to incite beautiful thoughts, and can direct a person toward, and can uplift a person spiritually. It can also excite a person's lust. Well, sound has the same power. So I suppose, that the argument is that the purpose behind it plays a part, right? And I say that kind of just just to say that the people who say it's permissible, it isn't without a sound argument. However, it is an argument that has not been adopted, that has not been agreed with by the majority of scholars, and that also has to be respected. And I tend to kind of take advantage of the minority view when it comes to my children, given the environment that they grow up in. All right, so I could be wrong, but that's what I've done. Anyway, Jazakumullahu khairan, and thank you for that resource. I'll share that on the YouTube. I'll share that on the YouTube chat as well, actually. Okay, inshallah. So if there's no other questions, we'll close up. Jazakumullahu khairan. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanakallah wa bihamdihi, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Sallallahu ta'ala wa sallam ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I'll see you next week, inshallah ta'ala. We'll carry on as usual. Okay, Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.